It's very easy for us to judge other people. In fact, it even feels good to do so. That is, after all, why decadent reality TV is so popular. We love the idea of watching those who foolishly wear their hearts on their sleeve in public, while we can sit back in private, silently and snarkingly casting judgment, without any true emotional investment, nor consequence. But while we are quick to cast a verdict onto others, something that most human beings cannot handle is to judge themselves. To look in a mirror, one-on-one, and have their true reflection look back at them, both inside and out. To face the one person who knows us better than anyone. The one person who sees through all our lies. The one person who knows who we truly are. Time is inarguably the most important asset that we all have. You can have all the wealth, power, and fame in the world, but without time, it will all be for nothing. And as such, we all try to use the time that we do have to the best of our ability, before we run out of it. Yet not all time is created equal. There are some opportunities that are only afforded to us when we are younger, and likewise some when we are older. The life of a 20-year-old, a 40-year-old, and a 60-year-old, for example, are often very different beasts. Which got me thinking, what is the most important time in a person's life? And thus I did a poll whereby I asked you all just that. What is the most important decade in a person's life? 16% of you answered with the childhood years. 19% of you answered with the teenage years. 48% of you answered with the 20s. 16% of you answered with the 30s, and not a single one of you answered with any decade above. And these results were, admittedly, pretty much exactly what I was expecting. It's no surprise that people don't think that the 40s and over aren't that important, as after all, by that point, people should have their lives somewhat established. The 30s I do understand, as this is the decade when most people will start their own families, and of course, getting that right is very important. The 20s being the majority opinion doesn't exactly shock me, as after all, this is the decade whereby most people will become real adults. And the teenage years are obviously also very important, the time when we completely transform both physically and mentally, while independently developing our own personalities. But contrary to popular belief, none of these are the most important decades, not by a long shot. In fact, only 16% of you answered correctly, and that is that the most important time of your life is your childhood. That's right, the time in your life when you can't even control your own bowels is by far the most important, and it's not even close. I understand that this might sound absurd upon first hearing, but if you understand how the human brain operates, then it's not actually all that surprising. The reason why the childhood years are the most important can be primarily summarized by 3 reasons. The first being brain plasticity. Now, I've spoken about this in a handful of other productions, but to summarize. Have you ever heard the quote, "You can't teach an old dog new tricks"? Well, as it turns out, you can't teach an old human new tricks either. When we are younger, our brain has much higher plasticity, which means we can learn things very quickly. But as we get older, our brain's plasticity decreases, making it much harder to take in information. This is why young people can learn things in no time at all, but an old person can't even figure out how to use the TV remote after weeks of use. If you imagine for a moment that knowledge is water, then when you're young, you're like a sponge, absorbing in information left, right, and centre. But when you're old, you're like a rock, tough to budge and stubborn. Thus, having access to knowledge early on in life is exceptionally important. Which brings us on to reason number 2, amplified experiences. Every experience you have when you're young is amplified because you aren't used to experiencing anything at all. Remember when you were younger and you played a video game that you thought was amazing? Today, you'd probably not care for it at all and likely need much more in order to be entertained. And this same logic can also apply in reverse. When you were young, you probably burst out crying over the most mundane of disappointments, whereas when something bad happens to you now, you are almost guaranteed to have more resilience against disaster. Everything when you were younger affected you more, whether positive or negative. Which brings us on to reason number 3, being foundational. I like to describe human beings like a Russian doll. With each decade, we add a new, much larger layer to ourselves, but what came before is still there, lying underneath, and it can never truly be removed. Everything you do in your 40s, 30s, 20s, etc. is all rooted in the childhood years. You may look back at yourself 5 years ago and roll your eyes in embarrassment, as most people do, but that drastic change from you then to you now only took place slowly on a day-by-day basis. You wouldn't be who you are today if it wasn't for your childhood, for better or worse. Overall, we humans like to think of ourselves as independent entities. But in retrospect, the irony is that we are actually naught more than a living conglomeration of every interaction we've ever had with other people. And thus, it's not really us who determines who we are, but those around us, and the experiences we have with them. And this is true especially when we're at our most vulnerable, when we are young. Thus, as you watch this production, I'm going to ask you to think back to the oldest memories from your childhood that are stored in that brain of yours. And from such, we may be able to reverse engineer your past so that you may understand not just why you are the way you are in the present, but also how you can become an even better version of yourself in the future. A process that I call conquering your childhood. In order to do this, we're going to analyse 3 different factors that I call the 3 A's. And as we go through them, I want you to decide whether your childhood had a low, medium, or high amount of each. So without further ado, let's begin with the first A. Attention. Attention refers to how much time parents take to spend with their children, playing with them, acknowledging them, and just being there for them. Children who receive a low amount of attention would be classified as being neglected. And neglect can of course have catastrophic consequences later on in life. For example, if a child doesn't get attention for their good behaviour, such as say, getting full marks on a test, but does get attention for their bad behaviour, such as say, breaking something, then the child will actually start to prioritise doing bad things over good things, simply because doing bad things is the only way that they get acknowledged. A mindset that can often manifest even later on in adulthood as well, as perhaps proven best via the trolling phenomenon. People today often think trolling just means being rude to other people online, but that's a warped definition. Traditionally, trolling meant pretending to be someone you're not in order to intentionally gauge a negative reaction from someone who thinks you're serious for comedic purposes. Purposely getting a rise out of people, simply because, to the troll, at least they are getting a rise at all. A rise they may not have been able to get should they have been themselves or tried to act politely due to their poor social skills. Though many perform trolling purely for innocent comedic purposes, it's my belief that people who engage in frequent obsessive trolling were likely neglected as children, hence why they manifest such behaviour in adulthood. All attention, after all, is good attention to the troll. It should be known that it's important to discipline your child for negative actions, but it's just as important to acknowledge them for their positive actions. Otherwise, they are almost guaranteed to be socialised into embracing negative reactions as positive, drastically hindering their social relations in the future. As proven by the fact that people who were neglected as children, especially in their earliest years of life, tend to have immense difficulty making friends or maintaining relationships in adulthood, as they tend to feel easily betrayed and are often quite smothering for obvious reasons. And such poor socialisation can often lead to the only source of happiness for said child being intellectual property, such as movies and games, which can lead to obsessive consumerism later on in life. As seen today with the fascination that many infantilized adults have for brands such as Marvel, Disney, and a myriad of other franchises from their youth. But those aren't the only consequences of neglect. Parents who often consider themselves too busy to look after their own children, usually due to being too focused on their oh-so-precious careers, often make the huge mistake of allowing their child to engage in highly distractive mental stimuli, such as browsing the internet. A phenomenon that I've called in the past iPad parenting. And I can't even begin to describe what an absolutely horrible decision that this is, as I believe that giving a child, especially at a young age, unrestricted access to the internet should genuinely be classified as abuse. Not just because, as observed by behaviours exhibited by Generation Alpha, aka those born after 2010, whereby much of their attention spans have been shredded, many of them struggle to communicate properly, and they have been artificially exposed to material that only adults should be aware of. But also because, much like how you wouldn't invite a random stranger off the street to babysit your child, you shouldn't trust random strangers on the internet to babysit them either. The vast majority of the internet was made for adults, by adults, and even places that were designed for children tend to be overwhelmed with creeps. It is thus almost inevitable that iPad parenting will lead to an introduction to questionable individuals and bad role models, as well as exposing them to a myriad of complex ideas, while not having the critical thinking skills required to judge them with nuance.
Communism sounds like a great idea. Why do we need free speech anyway? I'm a democratic socialist.
No, you're a child. It is, simply, depressing. Overall, someone who had a low amount of attention during childhood and thus was neglected is much more likely to enjoy negative attention, have immense difficulty making friends, struggle to maintain relationships, feel betrayed very easily, smother others with their presence, talk to questionable individuals, have bad role models, and engage in consumerism later on in life. Not good. Not good at all. Next, let's move on to what happens when one receives the opposite, an artificially high amount of attention, of which can be classified as being sheltered. Yes, believe it or not, it is actually possible to give your offspring too much attention. The Americans have a great phrase for this, known as helicopter parenting. Helicopter parents tend to obsessively limit their offspring's risk-taking capabilities in a very disciplinarian way, often forcing them to abide by a strict set of rules and schedules in an effort to protect them. Mothers tend to be much more likely to exhibit this kind of behaviour, particularly towards their youngest, which makes sense considering mothers have a much stronger innate biological desire to nurture and protect their kin than fathers do. And while this is healthy for the most part, it can, as with everything, go over the top. Helicopter parenting can manifest in two different ways. The first way is if the parents try to explain the underlying reasoning for their concerns, which can actually lead to the anxiety from the parents transferring to the child, paralysing them in fear. For example, a chap I know recently told me about his mother, who when he was younger was apparently a textbook helicopter parent, constantly worrying about everything. One of her concerns was him playing outside at night, as she had a deep-seated fear of him getting snatched, which is an understandable concern. However, when my friend used to ask her, "Why do I have to come home at night time?" she actually turned around and said, "Because there might be a man who comes out at night who will drag you into the woods and chop you up into little pieces." And this, needless to say, scared the hell out of him. He used to look up to the sky, and as soon as it started to turn dark, he'd run home to avoid this imaginary mysterious man as if he was Sonic the Hedgehog. And some of you might say, well, mission accomplished. But not really. Because though this attitude might work at preventing risky behaviour, it can also backfire and prevent normal living as well, as that chap would later go on to become an absolute nervous wreck later on in life, constantly focusing on every single possibility of what could go wrong, to the point whereby he never takes any risks whatsoever and pretty much never leaves his home out of fear, which is, needless to say, not much of a life. And I believe that the origin of this anxiety paralysis spawned from his overly protective mother constantly transferring her worries onto her son. As being told during your earliest years that the world is this dangerous hellscape where there's risk around every corner can seriously mess with your head later on in life. The second way is if the parents don't try to explain the underlying reasoning for their concerns at all, and instead just appeal to their authority. which can actually lead to a rebellious future. For example, if a child asked, "Why do I have to brush my teeth?" and the parents respond, "Because I said so," "because I said so" really isn't a satisfactory answer in educating the child as to why they want them to, in this case, brush their teeth. And too many blind appeals to authority of this caliber can subconsciously add up into causing resentment, whereby when the child gets older, particularly manifesting around the teenage years, they tend to overdose on rebellion and engage in risky behaviour. Primarily to unload the pent-up rage against their parents caused by their authoritarian sheltered upbringing. This is especially dangerous, as it is during childhood do we learn things such as how to handle failure and how to manage risk when the stakes are low and unimportant. But should such lessons be intentionally prevented by micromanaging parents, then such may only be learned later on when much older, when the stakes are much higher. And by the way, forceful religious indoctrination can also have a similar effect. I mean, I've said before, the vast majority of people today who are edgy atheists likely had parents who were fanatical Christians, who tried to force them into the faith. Which, needless to say, didn't work. Overall, someone who had a high amount of attention during childhood and thus was sheltered is much more likely to be very paranoid, risk-averse, have much slower personal development, and may come across as being much more naive. Whereas being neglected is universally recognised as being bad, being sheltered isn't really recognised as such, but it certainly should be. When it comes to attention, having too much or too little is evidently not satisfactory. Ideally, one would have a good middle ground that I call the Goldilocks zone. Rewarding good behaviour while also punishing the bad, but with good reason and explained well. Keeping an eye out to prevent negative influences, but allowing just enough freedom to learn risk aversion. A person in the Goldilocks zone of attention won't exhibit any of the negative traits of someone who was neglected or sheltered, but quite the opposite. Only valuing positive attention, finding it easy to make friends, maintaining relationships well, idolising only the worthy, understanding risk, and being well versed in social attitudes. So, dear viewer, how much attention did you receive? Too little and thus neglected? Too much and thus sheltered? Or just right in the middle and thus in the Goldilocks zone? I'd estimate that around 70% of the general population would be in the Goldilocks zone, with around 15% being neglected and 15% being sheltered, if I really had to guess. Next, let's move on to the second A, affluence. Affluence refers to how much wealth a person's family had when they were growing up. Children who had a low amount of affluence would be classified as being deprived. It doesn't exactly take a genius to say that growing up in a deprived home leads to much less opportunities later on in life, as children from deprived homes will by default be sent to low-quality public schools that are almost universally recognised as being subpar in every way. Certainly not taking advantage of the higher brain plasticity that they have, as mentioned earlier. And because children who are poor tend to exclusively grow up with others who are also poor, they tend not to have many valuable connections later on in life. As best displayed in highly class-based countries such as the UK, whereby social mobility is almost non-existent, regardless of effort or intelligence. Such blatant societal injustices can later go on to develop numerous personality problems to those who suffered under them. Birthing people who become either fanatically communistic, often found talking about how they want to destroy capitalism, evict the landlords, eat the rich, and nationalise everything. Or birthing people who become fanatically capitalistic, obsessively buying status symbols such as expensive watches, phones, and cars in order to prove themselves to the world.
Hey guys, check out my shiny new iPhone 16 Ultra. Yeah, it cost me like £2,000, but that's nothing for me though. I mean, yeah, I might work 20 hours a day, live off pot noodles, and have debts up to the eyeballs, but it's all worth it.
Pathetic. Both such extreme mindsets often birthed from deep-seated bad memories, such as their parents arguing about finances, not getting what they wanted at Christmas, and being made to feel like a lesser person due to their inherited poor social standing. But both of those are the rare ones. Because as financial difficulties are the number one reason cited for divorce, many such deprived children will likely be raised by a single parent, which, as long established, is a universal net negative. With people raised in single-parent households being much more likely to engage in self-destructive behaviour later on in adulthood, such as drinking, doing drugs, and having unprotected intercourse. And obviously, as poor areas tend to have a higher crime rate, children who grow up in such environments also tend to become engaged in such behaviour later on in life, such as going on to join gangs, commit crimes, and potentially even going to prison. Overall, someone who had a low amount of affluence during childhood and thus was deprived is much more likely to have fanatical behaviour, be bitter towards society at large, be consumeristic, be self-destructive, and dabble in criminal activity. And as neoliberalism in the Western world continues to bleed people dry, you can expect this type of upbringing to unfortunately become much more common in the future. Next, let's move on to what happens when one has the opposite, an artificially high amount of affluence, of which can be classified as being spoiled. Yes, as hard to believe as it may be, growing up with too much affluence can also be a negative. Children with wealthy parents will often be sent to high-quality private schools that are almost universally recognised as being top-notch in every way. And because of this, they tend to exclusively grow up with others who also have rich parents, and thus tend to have lots of valuable connections later on in life. Again, as best displayed in highly class-based countries such as the UK, where the wealthy form strict elitist cliches to the point whereby you can even become the Prime Minister with relative ease, so long as you went to the same school as the last guy. That's not even a joke. Such people tend to go on, not understanding that a big reason why they went on to become as successful as they did was, in large part, not because they are so fantastic, but because they had a leg up on everyone else right from the start.
It has not been easy for me. And, you know, I started off in Brooklyn. My father gave me a small loan of $1 million. I came into Manhattan. My father gave me a small loan of $1 million.
This leads them to have low empathy, patience, and sympathy for those worse off than them, due to not being able to relate to them in any way.
If you're homeless, just buy a house.
Such spoiled people also tend not to understand the value of money, never appreciating what they have due to not knowing what it's like to not have it. I'll never forget this video from back in the late 2000s, when a millionaire bought his daughter a new top-of-the-line sports car after passing her test, only for her to go on to cry after seeing it. Not out of joy, but out of anger, because it wasn't the colour that she wanted.
Mackenzie, it's fine.
A million billion times I wanted a blue car, Dad.
Come on, Mackenzie.
Can you please ask me for a blue car, man?
Right, stop filming.
But,
okay?
oh, Dad, it's off.
I saw that video 15 years ago, and I still have no idea whether it's fake or not. But if it isn't, maybe the communists were onto something after all. Speaking of communists, there is actually also a significant overlap between people who were spoiled as children and people who later go on to become far leftists later on in life. Or at least, pretend to. I'm sure almost everyone has noticed that the most annoying of vocal activists always seem to be of a middle or upper class origin. Often seen doing stupid silly things like sitting in the middle of a busy road, cementing themselves to said roads, publicly humiliating themselves via mindless vandalism, etc, etc. And I believe that a big reason such activists do this is due to a deep-seated subconscious guilt over their privileged upbringing, and subsequent loathing of themselves as a result. Hence why such activism tends to be quite ritualistically masochistic in nature, and why they tend to latch on to numerous societal-wide issues, such as climate change and identity politics. It's not because they actually care about such issues, as after all, if they did, climate change protests wouldn't just be about annoying working people, and identity politics wouldn't be so divisive. No, it's just a vain performative attempt for wealthy people to make themselves feel better about themselves. Unfortunately for them, however, no one likes a champagne socialist. Overall, someone who had a high amount of affluence during childhood and thus was spoiled is much more likely to have an unjustifiably inflated ego, have low empathy, not understand the value of money, not appreciate what they have, struggle to relate to the wider society at large, and obsessively focus on societal issues to placate themselves. Islington. When it comes to affluence, having too little or too much is again not satisfactory. Ideally, one would, once again, want to have a good middle ground in the Goldilocks zone. Having enough money to enjoy oneself and live in a good area, but not too much as to not appreciate what you have or become out of touch with others. A person in the Goldilocks zone of affluence won't exhibit any of the negative traits of someone who was deprived or spoiled, but again, quite the opposite. Refusing self-destructive behaviour, being a law-abiding citizen, having a moderate ego, having decent empathy, understanding the value of money, appreciating what they have, and relating to the wider society at large. So, dear viewer, how much affluence did you have? Too little and thus deprived? Too much and thus spoiled? Or just right in the middle and thus in the Goldilocks zone? I'd estimate that around 80% of the general population would be in the Goldilocks zone, with around 15% being deprived and 5% being spoiled, if I really had to guess. And finally, let's move on to the third and final A: adversity. Adversity refers to how paramount the challenges that one faced growing up were. Children who had a low amount of adversity would be classified as being dependent. Now, this one is really quite difficult to comprehend, so bear with me. Essentially, children who had a dependent upbringing didn't mentally rely on their parents, but on the contrary, their parents mentally relied on them. This is very commonly witnessed usually via a small subsection of single mothers, and sometimes even single fathers, who use their children as a sort of emotional pillow, talking to them about how unfair they've been treated, in one way or another. Usually via the other parent, or a monetary situation, or just society at large. The child essentially involuntarily becomes the parent's therapist, and subconsciously begins to attempt to use what little intellect they have to try to conjure solutions to their parents' problems, which often leads them to feel unwarranted guilt due to either feeling responsible for causing or not being able to fix such problems. Which, needless to say, should never happen. And this sort of premature burden can lead to many more catastrophic consequences later on in life due to such forced accelerated mental development. Most notable of which being that, in the case of men, they tend to always put their parents first, even above their own partner and children. And in the case of women, they tend to describe their parent not as their parent, but instead their friend, or sometimes even best friend. And parents, obviously, are not friends. Overall, someone who had a low amount of adversity during childhood and thus was dependent is much more likely to feel unwarranted guilt, mature early, sacrifice their own life experiences, always put their parents first, be easily emotionally manipulated, and never be able to relax. People should remember that a child is meant to depend on their parents, not the other way around. And finally, let's move on to what happens when one receives the opposite, an artificially high amount of adversity, of which can be classified as traumatic. This is about to get depressing. People who had a traumatic upbringing suffered an artificially high amount during their most formative years, and there are numerous reasons why this could be the case. Some merely being tragic circumstances, such as the death of a parent very early on in life. Others, however, could be artificial, such as suffering severe bullying from other children, or even worse, undergoing abuse from a guardian figure, such as a parent, teacher, or complete stranger, in a verbal, mental, or God forbid, physical way. The consequences that manifest later on in adulthood for those who had a traumatic upbringing are often beyond disturbing. Yet rather than list such consequences in a depressing fashion, I'm instead going to tell you the story about someone who I used to know that showcases exactly the kind of effect this type of upbringing can have on someone. But I'm going to warn you, it's a pretty sad story. Many years ago, back when I was in high school, I knew this girl who, to put it bluntly, kind of gave everyone the creeps. And the reason is because she came across to people as being quite fake. Always being happy, always smiling, almost like she was constantly being pumped with laughing gas or something like that. It was the kind of behaviour where you just felt like something was off, you know? Nevertheless, when we both graduated and thus parted ways in reality, we kept in contact with each other via the internet. One day, me and a friend of mine were sat around playing a video game. And yes, it was World of Warcraft, when all of a sudden, I get a call from this lady on Skype. She asked me what we're doing and I say we're playing a game, and knowing that she also played games, I suggested that she should also get it as well to play with us. She said to me, however, that she didn't have any cash on her, and that it probably wasn't a wise idea to ask her mother for some, as she was in a weird mood. I responded that the game had been out for a decade at this point, and it was only like £10, so it shouldn't be that much of a problem. But oh man, was it a problem. She, on the mic, asked her mother for the money, and her mother went from 0 to 60 borderline instantly, yelling at her in a furious rage, telling her things like, "All you do is drain me. I wish I never had you. I knew I should have had an abortion. You're a parasite. You ruined my life," etc., etc. And this didn't just go on for a few minutes, but around an hour straight. An hour straight of a constant torrent of absolute verbal abuse. Me and my other friend on Skype were just listening in, absolutely baffled. As it turned out, her mother was actually a schizophrenic, and was prone to having these spontaneous fits of rage quite frequently. So much so that British social services were aware of this, and they were both apparently even being monitored. Either way, I felt really bad for her after finding all this out, but it also made me realise something. The reason why she always seemed so happy all the time was because it was a coping mechanism, a mask of sorts, as she, due to her mother's frequent verbal abuse, had a deep-seated aversion to conflict that she constantly tried to manage by being ultra-agreeable to everyone she met. And this sort of compartmentalization of the brain, dampening certain emotions while emphasizing others, is unfortunately quite commonplace with those who have had a traumatic upbringing, whereby they develop a sort of false persona that allows them to try to live life normally. Sometimes, such as in her case, these personas can be masochistic in nature, emphasizing happiness while dampening anger, which often leads to being treated poorly by others later on in life. Whereas others can be sadistic in nature, whereby anger becomes emphasized while happiness becomes dampened, which can lead to treating others poorly later on in life. It could be argued that traumatic upbringings are the most damaging of them all, as our emotions and how we regulate them dictate the vast majority of the human experience. And should they not be regulated properly, said individual may come across as being quite broken and act as such. Overall, someone who had a high amount of adversity during childhood and thus was traumatized is much more likely to have abnormal emotional regulation, dampening certain emotions while emphasizing others, leading them to either have masochistic or sadistic tendencies. Really depressing stuff, and unfortunately, only becoming more commonplace. When it comes to adversity, having too much or too little is, yet again, not satisfactory. Ideally, one would want to have a good middle ground in the Goldilocks zone. Having parents who one could rely on, rather than the other way around, but never really needing to for anything serious. A person in the Goldilocks zone of adversity won't exhibit any of the negative traits of someone who was dependent or traumatized, but quite the opposite. Maturing as expected, having a healthy relationship with parents, regulating one's emotions as expected, and not creating artificial personas. So, dear viewer, how much adversity did you have? Too little and thus dependent? Too much and thus traumatized? Or just right in the middle, and thus in the Goldilocks zone? I'd estimate that around 90% of the general population would be in the Goldilocks zone, with around 5% being dependent and 5% being traumatized, if I really had to guess. So, there we have it. Attention, affluence, and adversity. If we look back at the 3 A's overall, the vast majority of people should find themselves in the Goldilocks zone of them all. A small group of people, however, will find themselves in one low or high category. An even smaller group of people may even find themselves in 2 low or high categories. And an absolutely microscopic group of people may even find themselves in 3 high or low categories. And for those people, I'm praying for you. Because the more high or low categories you find yourself in, the more unstable that you, as a person, will likely be today. When I originally started telling people about the 3 A's, they often gave me a reaction that I wasn't expecting. And that was that many people started to curse their parents and become bitter against them, blaming them for all the pitfalls in their life. Yet this is the complete incorrect conclusion to garner, as your parents, assuming they were born post-1960, were birthed into the very same dystopia that you were, and thus are of course likewise going to be flawed themselves. No. Those who are really responsible for an increasing amount of childhood flaws is none other than our neoliberal elites, who love to encourage mothers to work themselves to the bone while neglecting their young, who love to hypnotise and push deviancy onto children, and who love to break families into endless, inescapable economic poverty. But the past is the past, and you are not responsible for it, and nor can it be changed, even if you were. What you are responsible for, and what you can change, however, is the future. Because mark my words, the next few years and decades are going to be very harsh indeed. If you are nostalgic for better times already, such as the 1990s or 2000s, just wait to see how bad things will be in the 2030s and 2040s as society continues to morally disintegrate and economic consolidation of corporate power becomes undeniable. It is thus the responsibility of every individual of righteous conduct to be in tip-top form, as a grand moral uprising against such oppression is inevitable. But you aren't going to be able to help fix such a mess if you yourself are a part of the problem. So take this as an opportunity to privately put your pride aside and reflect on yourself, to analyse your childhood deeply and see if any such listed experiences resonate with you, so that you can start not just to acknowledge them, but to shed them, ensuring that you are ready to face the future. Your future. The best time to conquer your childhood was yesterday, but today is still better than tomorrow. Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed that. Look, it's important to start conquering your childhood because the way I see it is we're pumping out so many people, more broken people, than people of righteous conduct. And there needs to be more people of righteous conduct than broken people who keep making things worse if the world is ever going to stop this social decadence and bourgeoisie economics without sounding too fancy. So yeah, hopefully that this little model, the 3 A's, will help people in some way. Well, it doesn't really help people in some ways, it just gets the mind moving, gets people analysing, you know. It won't actually solve the problems themselves, that's on you, you know. But either way, hopefully it's of some use. Recently the Discord server has received a huge boom in population, and I think that's because I advertised it, so yeah, people join the conversation. We have a lot of spiritual conversations, religious conversations, Hex Radio every Saturday for like 12 hours straight. You don't want to miss out on this stuff, folks. And of course, I want to give a shout out to the Wall of Famers on Patreon. Yeah, I mean, my god, I am baffled that there's this many people supporting on Patreon. It's insane. I am truly honoured, to put it bluntly. I'm not very good at expressing gratitude at 4 o'clock in the morning, which is when I'm recording this, but hopefully my gratitude does come out. But nevertheless, hope you enjoyed this, and yeah, I'll see you next time.